I'm Guesser.
This is your host, Valor.
And I'm Tamir.
Hello, listeners. We are so excited to launch our first English episode today. As your host, I'm Valor, and my co-hosts are Tamra and Gisser are also present. Today, we will be speaking with Dr. Julian Dierkes, Associate Professor at the University of British Columbia, a passionate Mongolia observer and a contributor to the Mongolian Studies. Last year, his blog, Mongolia Focus, has won the Public Outreach Award. By the way, congratulations.
Thank you.
So, Julian, welcome to our podcast, and thank you for your time for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you for asking me. I always like to talk about Mongolia, so this is a great chance.
Great. So can you tell the listeners a little bit more about your research interest in Mongolia and what made you to travel to Mongolia first time?
So my university education was actually focused on Japan rather than Mongolia in sociology, though. The first time I lived in Japan as an undergraduate in my third year, when that year was complete, I decided to take the train home because I'm from Berlin, and so that's possible. So I took the train from Beijing back home to Berlin and went to Mongolia. So that was the first time I went in 1991. Unfortunately, I only had 20 minutes at Ulaanbaatar station, so I could only run outside and look around. But it all looked very attractive, and obviously from the train it looks beautiful in any case. But I continued on with my research on Japan, and then ended up in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia. But in 2004, at the time, President Bakban came on a state visit to Canada and decided, whether he decided or someone else decided, that they wanted to visit the University of British Columbia. And so suddenly we were playing host to the president of Mongolia. And because I had this longer term interest and curiosity about Mongolia, I said, okay, I'll organize that. And then that gave me the chance to, during the president's visit, he, spoke of sort of people's friendship between Canada and Mongolia, similarities in climate and those kind of things, but invited more cooperation. And so after the end of the visit, I said, oh, good, I'll go cooperate. Let me check that out. And so I went the first time really for a visit in 2005, but got keenly interested, and the question of why is a little bit hard. Sometimes I claim that I'm 150th generation Mongolian somehow, and that it just spoke to me. But Mongolia is if you focus your research attention on Japan, Mongolia is a very different place. It's demographically very young, very changeable, and that was the same in 2005 as it is today. So where Japan is pretty steady, not much change, not much excitement in social research, although there's lots of areas that still excite me now. Mongolia just seemed much more vibrant and exciting in a way. And so it was a nice contrast or a nice difference from my work in Japan. And the other factor probably is that as a German, I found lots of people in Mongolia to talk to because there's a strong relationship with Germany. And so, there were just sort of personal connections that came very easily in Mongolia in a way that it didn't necessarily elsewhere. And so it's just been enjoyable, and that reinforces research interest. Long answer, but there you go.
No, well, thank you so much. So since 1991, you started your blog in 2011. Is that correct? I went to your webpage and you said your first post was on July 2011. What took you so long to not write about Mongolia?
Well, that first visit in 91 really was just, that was just me traveling back from Japan, and it was just really sort of touristy. But why not start till 2011? So the blog started because at the time, Mende, who was my later did his PhD at the University of British Columbia, was already in Vancouver as a master's student. And then we got a visitor Byamjov, who was getting his PhD at the University of Hokkaido in Japan, and wanted to spend some time in Canada and came to visit the University of British Columbia. And so Mendy had always had a desk as a graduate student right outside my office. And then we found a space for Byamba as well. And we found ourselves, the three of us, talking about sort of Mongolian politics every day for an hour or so before the day got started. Mm-hmm. And at some point, we just kind of said, look, there's so few places where some of these discussions are happening outside of Mongolia, outside of Mongolian, that we should really share some of our thoughts with other people because, research on Mongolia is so dispersed across the world, right? There's very few places other than say Cambridge to some extent, right, where there's enough people in one place to have these kind of conversations. And so that's why we said, well, let's try this blog thing out, and I had blogged earlier on my last big research project in Japan. And so that's how Byamjov and Mendy and I got started with a blog. And then, we've just been keeping going ever since. And it's proven itself to be a useful outlet for some of our thinking, some research results and observations.
Yes, I agree, because in 2011, I was an undergraduate student in Chicago. And even though I was studying international relations, my attention was always into Mongolian politics and foreign policy. There was not much literature on Mongolia unless it's like published by, Maurice Razabi or, former ambassadors of, U.S. ambassadors to Mongolia. So I found your blog as almost like a linchpin of, foreign scholars and researchers who wants to know more about Mongolia, whether it's politics, society, or even just basic hot topic, right? So it's been 9 years since you began your blog. Do you notice any difference in terms of the subject matter in your perspectives when you were starting to write in 2011 and now like after 9 years? I don't know, has your perspective changed in some ways in the subject matter?
If we bring it back to 2005 in my first visit, so if we cover those 15 years, political and sort of economic social developments in Mongolia obviously have changed the place and the people and politics. And so, there's sort of waves of what's happened over that time. So, for example, the late 2000s were all sort of dominated by the promise of Oitogo and the discussions around how to set that up. Then the early 2010s were all dominated by all this money that was rolling in and high growth economy. And then that ended and things really shifted around to focus more on, when that, it wasn't quite a bust, but when that super boom ended, what does that mean for politics? How do people interpret that? And then probably the last phase is sort of the last 4 or 5 years, where the corruption politically has become ever more oppressive and has changed things around quite a bit and has blocked a lot of the political developments that we all would have hoped for, 10, 15 years ago. And so there's sort of the changes that Mongolia has undergone more than our interest shifting. I guess our interest shifted along with changes in the polity and society.
Mm-hmm. So you also wrote a lot about corruption, election, and also mining industry. Now, you mentioned in your last article that you have observed Mongolia's 7 national elections, right? Is that parliamentary and presidential?
That's right. So from 2008, I've been there for the election campaign every time, obviously except for this year, and was so for 6 elections and was an election observer, accredited election observer, 5 out of those 6. Yeah, so it's 2008, 9, 12, 13, 16, 17, and then missing out this year, of course.
Mm-hmm. So at least from our perspective, right, because we're all in the States, and unless you're in Mongolia, like actually observing what's happening, you can't really see the maybe perhaps the actual process of the election, how people are going to vote, what people are saying and talking about the election itself. What would you say you have witnessed in relation to Mongolian election and corruption? Was it just gossip, or there was actually an evidence, people would tell you like, okay, a car came in and told me if you vote for this person, we'll give you this much bribery, or such cases?
Yeah, so the role of formal election observation is quite limited, right? What happens on the day itself as an election observer, typically, if you're part of a big team, then you get assigned maybe a district or Naimag or a part of Ulaanbaatar or so, and you visit the polling stations. You also have a bit of a chance to ask around, right? You can obviously approach people on the street and introduce yourself, say, oh, I'm an election observer. Has anyone approached you? Obviously, anyone who's not an observer. But, it's not really an investigative policing sort of a role, and it's not intended to be that, right? It's observation. It's passive observation more than anything. And so I'd have to say, in the 5 times that I've been an election observer formally, the only things that I've ever seen, there were actually 2 instances of someone helping an elderly voter to mark the ballot. And then as they walked out the polling station, we sort of walked after them just to check it out. And then they just immediately left. And so it was relatively clear that this wasn't a relative. But that's sort of the formal observation. But the bigger piece, of course, is that there's a lot of opportunities to have conversations, even more so during the campaign than during the election itself, and to talk to campaign workers, to talk to party officials about, what they're nervous about, but also obviously the substance of the campaign. But what's been striking all along in Mongolia is that everyone always asserts electoral fraud, right? Everyone you talk to says, oh, yeah, there's big cheating going on. But the piece that's frustrating about this, and it's sort of relevant because we're recording on December 11th, so just an hour ago, the Supreme Court has finally struck the last of the really silly suits that Trump supporters have brought.
Yes, in Texas, right?
Absolutely, right. And so what I find frustrating in the context of Mongolian elections is that there's so much talk all the time, but no one ever produces any kind of evidence of actual electoral fraud, right? There's a lot of allegations. And then if you talk to party officials privately, they often also acknowledge that they cheat and the other side cheats. So the NPP and the DP both cheat, which at that point you're like, well, that seems to balance out roughly. But that's not right. If there actually is cheating going on, then we ought to see evidence, and that evidence ought to be prosecuted. But that doesn't happen. And it's exactly what's happening in the US, that the soon-to-be former president is alleging all this fraud without any proof whatsoever, right? And it's really detrimental to democracy, and that's a real danger in Mongolia. That the election needs to be guarded safely, but it also needs to be given a chance to be trusted. And when people assert electoral fraud but don't offer proof, they really undermine the credibility of an election, and I find that rather frustrating. That's not to say that I don't think that there is fraud. There does seem to be, because everyone talks about it. But then in a way, either you bring proof or you shut up, right? Because the purpose is to defend democracy. And so if you can't bring evidence of fraud, then you should also not spend your energy undermining the election or credibility of the election by asserting all this fraud that you have no proof for.
Well, since you touched on democratic institution and, legitimacy of an election, it seemed to me, at least, that every time there's an election, the losers complain, right? I don't care if it's the Democrats in the States or Democrats in Mongolia, especially in the last parliamentary election. But like you said, there isn't any evidence, but that doesn't mean that there was no electoral fraud. But if you look at like cyberspace, right, like Facebook, Twitter, everybody's complaining about, there was a fraud, there was corruption, there was bribery. But like you mentioned, there's nothing there's nothing legal document saying that, the Mongolian election was not legitimate. So what does it say about the greater, democratic institution, the actual institution itself, and how it affects, people's trust in their government, which is really important topic, and I'm really glad that you actually brought that up. So could you elaborate based on your observation, why is it important for democratic institutions to safeguard the legitimacy of an election? So in terms of Mongolia, obviously, since we've been having elections since 1991, and next year that we're going to have presidential election.
Yes.
And the Mongolian constituencies will also be voting. So, without what is the legitimacy here? Where's the people trust in government if they're already assuming that there has been fraud?
Yeah, I mean, those are a lot of challenging issues, Bolo, and it's partly just about the actual act of voting, but obviously that plays into sort of political culture, how parties develop, how citizens interact with a state, and sort of, democracy writ larger than just the act of voting, right? Because, of course, a democracy is not all about voting, but voting for citizens is the moment where you interact most with the state and most directly, and where you really have a say. And so while it's important to also promote education for democratic thinking and to promote development of political parties and of political debates and so forth, that voting moment really is very important, right? And you want governments to be able to say that they are supported by, well, if it's a coalition, and it's a coalition, but by the majority of the people, so that they can act on behalf of the nation. And so that really is, there needs to be, I think, for governments to be legitimate and to have some legitimacy with the population, the way by which that government has come about needs also some legitimacy, and that is the act of voting and counting the votes and deciding on the composition of parliament on the basis of that. And so that's why I think the notion of not calling electoral results into question unless you really have proof is so important, right? Because over time, and this is one of the changes I'd say, obviously 2008 was a bit of a different situation because of the riots and the deaths that came just after the election. But if I look at the election, say from 2009 to 2020, then that stream of allegations of fraud and people talking about votes being paid for and so forth has probably grown in prominence, right? That there were some, obviously 2008, that's what sparked the riots, but all along there was some talk of some kind of electoral fraud or so. And there's always been responses, right? And there's a lot of technology deployed in Mongolia to combat that. But I think the voices have grown louder over time. And it's not just sort of sore losers always, but there's lots of voices. And I think there's more Mongolians these days, more voters who also aren't entirely sure anymore whether their vote does a whole lot. And that's not just about the electoral process, that's also about how the parties operate and so forth. But overall, there's less enthusiasm about democracy and about the act of voting than there was 15 years ago, I would say.
I have a question. First of all, thank you for being with us today again. So based on your observation and research, what do you think over the years Mongolian election and Mongolian democracy has done right, and what could be done better?
Also a good question, Gesa, and a lot of issues sort of tied with that. So in terms of the technology of an election, Mongolia is far advanced over many other places that vote, right? And there's been all these technology safeguards put in place to protect the election. like the electronic counting, like the displays, the cameras you get installed in the polling station with a feed outside that people can watch, like the statistical breakdown of voters on the day at the polling station. I mean, these are all measures that were designed to build trust in the act of voting because they increase transparency. So I think those have been all very good attempts to respond to the mistrust and the allegations by building transparency. The odd thing is that hasn't built the trust, right? That people just keep asking more and more questions. And we saw this in the last two weeks or 2 months, that when all this craziness in the US involved, there are allegations about the Dominion voting machines and the software, and immediately you saw people picking that up in Mongolia saying, oh, same system that's used here, and we've always thought it was hacked and all that. Mm-hmm. And so I think the technology has been really impressive, and it's been a real genuine attempt to safeguard the vote, but it has not succeeded at building the trust. I think another piece of the election that has been quite successful in Mongolia is voter education. That even though the voting system has changed every time, while this year 2020 was a return to 2008, but we've have different voting systems and for Parliament. So even though that's changed every time, I think the General Election Commission has done a very good job with brochures, with information, with public service messages, that I've always had the sense that voters in the polling stations knew what they're doing. There was no question about it. It's fairly rare that you see people with their ballot having to return to someone from the Election Commission and say, I don't understand this, what's going on here. Voters know what to do. And that's not always the case everywhere. And so I think that's a real success, and that the Election Commission has focused a lot of resources on voter education and has succeeded in that. Go ahead.
I just had, you mentioned an interesting topic that, after the parliamentary election results, a lot of people who were not satisfied with it started advocating for having so-called proportional system, where, the percentage of certain parties will get the number of seats equivalent to that percentage of overall. So what do you think would be, do you think that's a, good way of doing it, or, is there a better way, or should we stick with it right now?
Yeah. So, that's also a very interesting question, and in part because Mongolia is so unusual in that over the last 15 years, the electoral system has changed so much. Honestly, I wish someone would just decide to stick with something for a couple elections. What I see a little bit in those discussions, and this happens with a lot of legislation in Mongolia as well, that there's a lot of people who have this idea that there's a perfect law out there, or that there's a perfect electoral system out there and it just needs to be implemented. But that's simply not true. When we look at electoral systems, they all have advantages and disadvantages, right? So here in British Columbia and Canada, we've had a long-standing debate about proportional representation, because Canada, all elections are first past the post. They're British-style Westminster democracy. So just like the US, everything is first past the post. And people for a long time have said, well, one of the things we really don't like about a majoritarian election system is that minority views get sort of shunned aside, right? And that there's no sense that, let's take the Green Party in the Canadian context, that in recent elections, the Green Party has steadily been winning more votes, but ends up with no seats in provincial or federal parliaments because of first past the post. So this is a long-standing debate. However, proportional systems have all kinds of challenges. Right? They mirror the public's opinion better because more parties are available to choose from. But then they also tend not to have big majorities, right? So that you always end up with coalitions, which in the end perhaps act a bit more like a duopoly as there is in the US or as there is in Mongolia increasingly. And so electoral systems all have disadvantages and advantages, and none of them are perfect. And so in many ways, I think you pick one and you try to work with the disadvantages and lessen their impact and rely on the advantages and make that work. But that's just sort of my view on that changing every time doesn't really help anyone very much. I'm German. I grew up in Germany, so I've always grown up with proportional representation of sorts, and so that seems better to me. But there's nothing wrong with majoritarian systems. Just make them work.
Quick clarification. So is it true that I read it somewhere that, when they first came up with Mongolian constitution, a draft for the Mongolian constitution, it was based more on German than the US?
Yeah, although the political system doesn't, one of the interesting things about the Mongolian constitution and the democratic revolution is it was pretty Mongolian, right? It was not full of imports. There were very few foreign actors who were involved at all. And so, in terms of the electoral system, surely people were sort of looking around the world what to do, but then came up with their own setup. And that's how Mongolia ended up with this sort of hybrid presidential parliamentary system that was changed a little bit last year with the constitutional amendments, but it's still, it's its own thing. It's not unique in the world, but it's kind of its own thing. And so for the electoral system, I mean, there were discussions at the time about also keeping the bicameral system, right, with two chambers of parliament, and we sometimes hear those discussions again now. But it's been really a bit more of a fluid setup all along for Mongolia, where there's more discussion of experimentation and maybe making changes, which is good because it's a way to evaluate institutions. I'd say maybe a bit too much change over the past several elections, that having a new system every time is a little bit, I don't know what exactly that accomplishes.
I just wanted to take a moment to remind our listeners that you are listening to 77 Nation Podcast, and our guest today is Dr. Julian Dierkes. So my question is this. I used to ask this question from many people, and this relates to the hybrid, presidential and, prime ministerial system and constitution that we have. What are, Mongolia being having the parliamentary constitution, I think it has a lot of advantages over, compared to other so-called socialistic, countries. Though it was never part of USSR, it was obviously majorly influenced. I always used to ask this. Compared to other countries like, for example, Canada or Great Britain, Australia, that have parliamentaries and as a leader of the executive branch having the prime minister, does Mongolia need a president?
Yes.
So Polo says yes. Okay.
Wait, no, that's a good question. But after that, no, the conversation is going directly to the presidential statutes that I was going to ask. So thank you, Gisser, for asking that.
All right. So Polo says yes, a president. Tamir, you haven't said anything. What do you think on president or parliament?
I have no opinion at this moment.
And Gisser, you asked the question, but what's your view?
So I have an example on this. As you'd hear a lot of people in Mongolia saying, we need a strong leader who's going to come and do everything right in this country and perhaps lead us in the better way. And the great example they would take as the US in good cases, in some cases as president of Russia, right? And I think there is a major thing that a lot of people don't understand. In the US, where there's more or less a strong separation of powers, with checks and balances, having a strong judicial, branch, executive and legislative branches. The leader of the executive branch is in Mongolia is, in my understanding, is the prime minister, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's another one, a president, right, who has certain powers, not exactly, in my opinion, the executive branch, but, stuff like presidential appointments of the judicial, branch and stuff like that. But what do other parliamentary countries do without president? Who does the, presidential appointments?
Right. So just a quick preamble, I think the choice between presidential and parliamentary and all the other systems that are out there, I would say the same thing as about electoral systems. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. There's no perfect choice. So You set one up and you make it work. So that would be my first point. Why do you need a president, actually, right? So there's a lot of the examples of parliamentary systems you mentioned have a head of state separate from the prime minister, right? Okay. So that very oddly for Canada and the United Kingdom, that happens to be a queen, which is obviously quite peculiar, okay. Although has no political meaning in the sense that the queen doesn't actually make substantive decisions about anything, and it's really just it's symbolic, right?
Yes.
But if you don't, separate from that head of state role, same in Germany, of course, because Germany has a president who takes largely a symbolic role, but is sort of a backstop if things went really terrible. Potentially, the president would have more of a role. But all the tasks that are delegated or that are owned by presidents, including the Mongolian president, are easily taken up by parliaments, right? So there's no reason why ambassadors cannot be appointed by cabinet or by the prime minister, who is controlled by parliament, but that they have to be appointed by a president instead, as is the case in Mongolia. Okay. Right, parliamentary systems are perfectly able to appoint ambassadors. There's all kinds of mechanisms, institutional mechanisms for how to appoint judges and prosecutors that don't rely on a single figure that is directly elected. And so there's all kinds of ways to do that. And it is very possible, and there's obviously many examples around the world that do just fine making all those appointments, right? I mean, you could throw another sort of comparison into this and say, Mongolia is what we think of as a unitary state, right? In that it's hierarchical, in that an IMAG, as the equivalent of a state or a province, takes its orders, if you will, and legislation from the national level. And this is opposed to federal systems like the US, like Canada, like Germany, where the regional unit, the IMAC equivalent, the state, the province, whatever that is, has much greater leeway to make decisions.
Yes.
And again, it's not that one is perfect or one is better than the other as a system, but they have disadvantages and advantages. They're just different ways to organize things. And so I'm pretty agnostic on the Mongolian debates about presidential versus parliamentary. It's a little confusing, though, I'd have to say, that the hybrid system is not super clear, right? Because it leaves it a little bit unclear what exactly the powers of the president are, and the past several presidents have all pushed on that and have tried to gain more power because they're in that office, right? Nothing surprising about that. And it has been a little bit unclear, which is confusing sometimes. I would also dispute this idea that somehow presidents produce strong leadership. Look at the disaster that the US has been for the last 4 years, right? So God, if you only wish there was a parliament that would have kept that nutcase in check for the world, right? Not just for the US. But these things, they swing in different directions, man.
Follow-up question on that. How do you ensure strong judicial independence without, presidential appointments? Well, how do they do that in Canada or, Great Britain?
Yeah, so that is obviously a question that's really relevant to Mongolia, right?
Yes.
And judges get appointed in all kinds of different ways. You have the example in the US where there's many jurisdictions in many states where judges are elected in some way, and so are prosecutors to some extent. That's one version, but it has the advantage of accountability to the people. But it probably has the disadvantage of that process being politicized, right? That it's not really clear. I mean, what you really want is independent and competent judges, and it's not entirely clear that an election is the best way to produce that. Other countries have very different systems. In Canada, judges are ultimately appointed by the government, but in a relatively transparent fashion, right? They have to be qualified for their job, obviously, and every country does that, right? That you meet certain minimum criteria and so forth. But then they end up being appointed either at the provincial or the federal level by the government.
Okay.
Sometimes through a public process, but not necessarily. There's different versions of that, for example, if you take the Constitutional Court in Germany, it is usually appointed by a rough party proportionality, although that's not governed by law. That's just sort of more habit, if you will, that the parties sort of take turns appointing judges. And that's an interesting area where what's also been exposed in the US over the past several years, and to some extent in Mongolia as well, that the Constitution doesn't always prevent all abuse, right? There's only so far that checks and balances can go, because when people ignore some of the basic assumptions about democracy, then sometimes constitutional institutions are relatively powerless. And so what you need constitutional safeguards and institutional mechanisms, but you also need a consensus on the desirability of democracy generally and of the independence of the judiciary. And thus you need an electorate that also punishes transgressions against that. And so it's not entirely a matter of how this happens mechanically, but it also depends on how much people want that independence and are willing to enforce it, for example, through voting.
Very interesting. So I said yes, and now I suppose I should give you guys explanation why Mongolia should have a president, right? The way I understand is this, that the Mongolian presidency statute is symbolic, for one. For two, I think it's more for accountability purposes. Now, I say accountability because you have 76 members of the parliament who come up with, laws and regulations and legislations. Even though the president is symbolic under the Constitution, he or she does have the power to legislate laws and enact those laws, right? Yeah. So the incumbent government is discussing whether the president should be selected from the parliament versus the people. Now, this is a big issue too. I'm saying issue not as like a negative thing, but it's just, I think ideologically and practically, it's going to cause, it's not necessarily a governance issue. It's more about how the Mongolian populace sees the leader, right? So you have 76 representatives from districts or, AMUCs or whatever, but then you need that individual person or the symbol kind of to guide the 76 parliamentarians and then the cabinet. If you have a coalition government, we all know what happens at coalition governments, right? Between the Republicans and Democrats, and you take this, I take that. If you give me this, I give you that. So I always felt like the president is kind of a balancer of the parliamentary and the cabinet itself, but more on the accountability and credibility purposes. I don't know if you guys agree or not, but Julian, what is your thoughts on Mongolia's pursuit in choosing the president from the parliament, not from the people?
So the piece that I disagree, so I think, Bodo, you've lived in the US too long. this idea that coalitions don't work and are harmful. This is a very North American and Anglo idea. All of continental Europe has coalition governments and does just fine. Thank you very much. Japan has been coalitions. Everyone does coalitions. It's just that there's this peculiar idea coming out of the UK and Westminster parliamentarism, which has somehow spilled over into the US and into Canada, that somehow coalitions are ineffective and evil. So I totally disagree.
What I meant was that the Mongolian cabinets, like you have a coalition government of the Democratic Party and then not Republican, what's the other one?
People's Party?
People's Party.
Happy to help.
and then the cabinets, they can't really come to a solution.
Of course they can. So hang on, Buller. There hasn't been a coalition government in many years now in Mongolia, right? It's been a long time. But there are so many examples around the world where coalition governments come to results, no problem at all. Just because they're forming a government from two parties doesn't mean that they can't agree on decisions, including in cabinet, right? There's nothing inherent about that. It does happen. I totally agree, right? You get dysfunctional coalitions just like you get dysfunctional majority governments. It happens all the time. And that's why I'm saying none of these systems produces perfect results, right? They produce different results to some extent. And they all have their advantages and disadvantages. But that's what you live with as a political system. And fortunately, we all happen to live in democracy, so we get a voice in that, right? And that's the good thing. And so, from my perspective, president voted on by parliament. I don't really have a big perspective on that. I would say, is that really necessary? Do you really have to make that change? Is it really going to make Mongolia a better functioning, a better, democracy and better for its people? I doubt it, because I don't think the systems determines that. If people would focus as much energy in Mongolia on making the system work as they sometimes do on changing the system, all Mongolians would be better off, I would argue.
I was wondering why would, especially now the incumbent government would propose such, decision is I'm wondering if they're trying to limit the presidential power when the president is from a different party. Then now we're talking about just party politics, which, to be honest, I really hate and I don't want to talk about it. So I'm just wondering if it has something to do with agendas being more coherent and unified versus you have a Democratic Party president and you have, opposition party government and there's a constant collision and therefore the country does not move forward. You're just doing politics day and night, right? I don't know.
So that's interesting, right? Because Mongolian voters have had a real habit of going back and forth between the parties, right? Basically, yes. Up until this election, we've always seen a back and forth from election to election. And it's the first time that an incumbent party has won anything. And so that's just, I just find that interesting to observe. You don't want to talk about parties, but the lack of actual meaning to the party is one of the big challenges for Mongolian democracy, I think. But
I agree. I totally agree. But once you start talking about party, then the conversations goes on for like 3 hours.
This is true. That could be fun too. But right, so there's been this back and forth all the time, and so I think any governing party, particularly when, like the MPP at the moment, it's had such two big majorities, feels like maybe they should change the system. Some of that may be partisan, that they're just solidifying their advantage, but there could also be, right, that's not to say that there isn't a genuine motivation. So it's the same thing as in discussions about proportional representation in Canada, for example, that, people object to that, saying that one party or the other is just trying to solidify its advantage, right? And they're really only talking about the electoral system because it benefits their party. And that's really hard to tell from the outside. And I would say the same thing about some of the discussions in Mongolia, that sometimes you get the sense of, they're just trying to, so at the moment, the People's Party may well just try to curtail the power of the president because the president is the other guy. But they may also, so I think the constitutional amendments last year, for example, limited the power of the president a little bit, but they also made some sense to just clarify things, right? So it's not always partisan gains that motivate these, although sometimes obviously it is.
Great, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I have a last question from me. What is your take on constitutional amendments that were passed recently?
So I would talk particularly about two kinds of amendments. Let me first talk about the not so happy story, which is the judicial appointments. And what we saw last March was the judicial appointments being passed to the National Security Council, or that being formalized, but that also the power to fire judges was given to the National Security Council. And that was a terrible idea, I have to say, because it really undermines the independence of the judiciary and has really been is really a threat to the rule of law, which is essential to running a democracy. And we were promised that the amendments would be passed, and then subsequently there would be legislation that would define some of the things that the amendments called for. But that legislation hasn't been passed. And so we're in a situation where I think judicial independence was undermined significantly last year, and it hasn't been fixed by the amendment. So I think that's very problematic. The other area where the amendments changed cabinet around a bit, it's a bit early. I mean, the double deer is a very unusual Mongolian obsession that somehow there's something wrong with cabinet members also being MPs, which is, in a place like the UK or Canada, all of cabinet are MPs, and that works just fine too. Anyway, this has been people have seen this as a problem in Mongolia. So now we have 4 members of parliament at most in cabinet. It has produced a cabinet now that is full of people who seem to have more substance expertise than ministers typically had in other cabinets. And so perhaps the decision-making in the ministries and by the ministers has become a bit more expertise-based. This has probably raised the power of the prime minister, because the ministers are no longer sort of these competing power centers, because many of the ministers we have in cabinet now don't really seem to be politically very powerful. They don't have a parliamentary base that they can force anything on the People's Party or so. And so this has given a bit more power to the prime minister. But it's a little bit too early to tell what's going to happen. So we don't know, for example, what role parliament will play now that there's no or very few MPs in cabinet. The amendments foresaw a parliament that would also have some investigative power over the government, right, to call committees and the like.
Yes.
We haven't seen examples of that, and maybe that seems unlikely right now because the MPP majority is so big. And so in some ways, I don't think we've really seen enough to know whether that change has been productive in the sense of, that game that used to go on where the prime minister tries to appoint a minister and the president vetoes it and back and forth. That never seemed particularly productive. So maybe getting rid of that seems like a good thing, but we don't quite know yet because we'll have to see how this plays out in different parliaments and how it changes the role of parliamentarians. And so those are the two big areas I'd emphasize in the amendments. I'd give a thumbs down to the judicial changes and a cautious thumbs up to some of the cabinet and parliament changes.
Thank you.
Hey, Gisela, do you remember when we were interviewing candidates for the parliamentary elections and we asked them about gerrymandering? Because, whether Mongolia has gerrymandering, because if they would lose one area, they would just, travel to different provinces and, start doing their campaign over there. Julian, I know you have a lot of experience in, observing Mongolia's elections, both national and, local. What is your thoughts on how to enhance the election system where people just jump around and just looking for votes without really knowing the locals, without really knowing the locals' issue. Therefore, if you don't know the issue, what are you going to fix?
So I think that's a really interesting question. There's two parts to this. I think let's start with a global part. I think how to draw electoral boundaries has become a big challenge in many democracies. And part of that is that we have such population movements over time that we think the electoral system needs to respond, but we're not quite sure how to do that fairly. And so the same holds true in Canada. We just had a provincial election here in British Columbia earlier in the fall. And the imbalance you get in Mongolia, that a rural vote counts for more than an urban vote, also holds for British Columbia. And so there's calls now for that needs to be shifted because so many people have moved to the city. The population of the city is proportionally so much bigger. But it's very difficult how to decide how to do that. In the Canadian context, that is meant to be a non-political decision, but it becomes very complicated. And so this is an ongoing issue, not just in Mongolia, but in a lot of other places because people move around. The more Mongolia-specific challenge, part of it at least, is that Ulaanbaatar that Mongolia has become such a centralized society, right, and polity, that really the population of the capital is so dominant, and it's so dominant as an economic center, but also a political center, that it's very difficult to think of, even though the votes in the countryside count more, it doesn't really seem like politics is made for the countryside. There's seem to be very few initiatives that are really focused on policies that aim to improve the lot of people living in the countryside, which then means even more people move to the city. And so I don't know whether that's an issue that's really best fixed by changing electoral system or by changing the election districts. I think that would be better addressed by very substantive discussions, political discussions around how Mongolia wants to see that balance between the city and the countryside, and how countryside livelihoods are to be maintained, right? I mean, politicians love to portray themselves as nomads of some kind, right? They say, oh, when I used to stay out with my grandparents, and then Ebek Dodge always took his pictures on horseback. Batulak likes to take his picture in a deer, right? There's all this symbolic attention to countryside roots, but the policy is really made for the city. And I don't see much substantive debate about how that balance between the city and the country, and how the country life can be enhanced, right? I don't see much of that in politics. And so we end up focusing on these structural features like electoral districts, rather than talking about the substance of what it means to be a country that is urbanizing rapidly, even though people's identity is so bound to the land and to the countryside.
Wonderful. Okay. Hello? Is everybody there?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Julian, so much. We have talked for 1 hour already, and I wish we had more time. And I wanted to ask you more about foreign policy, but, obviously election and governance is such an important issue for Mongolia, and your expertise was very much enlightening. So may I ask you the final question on Mongolian foreign policy? What would you say the strengths and weaknesses of Mongolia's foreign policy as of today?
So I think the biggest success for democratic Mongolia, so for the last 30 years in foreign policy, has been the third neighbor policy and its attempt to balance good relations with the immediate neighbors with also growing relations with the rest of the world. And that has been surprisingly successful, in the sense that, the neighbors get pushy sometimes, but I at least believe or see no existential threat to Mongolia. No one's going to invade neither neighbor at this point, or really considers that an option. And that's pretty good when you're squeezed between two kind of unruly, very powerful neighbors. So it's been very successful in that regard. I think the the embrace of industrialized democracies and other democracies as partners that are far away has raised Mongolia's profile internationally quite a bit. It's a little unclear how much Mongolians individually benefit from that. So the fact that more political people in the world know about Mongolia and have this image of the democracy, the only post-socialist Asian democracy and all that, whether there's material benefits that derive from that may be a little bit unclear, but there certainly are a lot of symbolic benefits in that Mongolia participates in discussions and is taken seriously in discussions that it wouldn't be on the basis of the size of its economy or the size of its population. So I think the third neighbor policy has been a success in giving Mongolia a greater voice in global affairs than it would have otherwise. Have there been any great failures? Not really, I think. We could point to peacekeeping missions and the involvement in multilateral activities at the UN level. That has been successful, I think, for Mongolia. Some of the last 5 to 10 years are much more focused on trade diplomacy, and some of that is looking promising within an Asian context. So I think overall, foreign policy has been effective for Mongolia.
All right, thank you. Our podcast is nearing the end, and on our podcast, we have a customer question for our guests. Suppose our young listeners haven't chosen their future profession. What profession will you recommend for our young Mongolian listeners?
Oh, that's obvious. Podcaster, right? It's the way of the world. It's the wave of the future.
No, he's gonna say study sociology.
Study Mongolian politics. We need more people that. Profession of the world. Future professions. I mean, one of the big changes the world is undergoing is a shift towards information and information-based societies and economies. And so one of the things that I at least pretend like I would study that now if I was younger. And it's easy to muse in hindsight, right? And say, oh, wouldn't that be a great career? But, the idea of information management, information engineering, I think is a very promising area where so much of our life is going to be shaped by how we interact with all kinds of information, that I can only imagine that would be a career that would be rewarding for young people to take up now, because it would have them participating in big changes. Whether that pays financially or not, I think would be less of a criterion for me, but you would be participating in big global human changes, and that's got to be interesting. So I'm going to vote for information engineer as the profession to pick.
Okay, thank you.
Sounds great.
Wonderful.
Thank you for participating and giving an interview to our first English episode, and thank you for your time.
Oh, what a pleasure and what an honor. Yeah, what an honor to be the first.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for your time.